So hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to my favourite books of 2016 video. So I originally had it planned out very neatly and nicely that this was going to be a top 16 of 2016, and then on Christmas Day I received a book that I then read on Christmas Day, also nearly in one sitting, and it was so good that it had to go in like my top 5, and then it became a top 17, and that felt not neat, so now it's a top 20. So I'm afraid this may be rather a long video, and I'm sorry, but I read a lot of very good books this year. I think I read about 121, 122 books, and so yes, many of them were great. So yes. Today I'm going to talk about my favourite books of the year, and there are many, many brilliant books. It's been very hard to make this list, but anyway. So I do have these in a kind of order from 20 to 1. The order is a bit shaky, but it's kind of roughly correct, and especially the top 5 I would say are definitely like the 5 best books I've read this year. But anyway, at number 20 is Desperate Remedies by Thomas Hardy. There are 3 Thomas Hardy books in my top 20 books of the year, which is very exciting. This year has very much been a year of Thomas Hardy. I have now, in December, finished all of the novels of Thomas Hardy. I've now read all his novels, which means at some point in the next year, or the next 6 months, or maybe earlier, there will be a fortnight of Thomas Hardy, just as I did with Dickens and Brontes and Jane Austen. I have been buddy reading my way through Hardy with Alicia from Ex Libris, Yamini from The Skeptical Reader, and Anne from Beyond the Pages for quite a lot of this year. It's been a lovely experience. They started before me and I kind of joined in when I think about the time that Alicia discovered my channel and realised I like Victorian literature a lot. And it's been a real pleasure to get to know them through the reading, but also to read Hardy in a very kind of intense way, because I'd read maybe, I don't know, before this year I'd probably read 4 or 5 Hardy novels, and then I just read so many this year. I read like, I guess it must be 8 or 9 books I've read this year by Thomas Hardy, maybe even more because I read some short stories of his as well. So it's been a year full of a lot of Hardy, and it's been thoroughly enjoyable to read his books because I love him as a writer and he's so good, and it's been a really nice experience to read his works as a buddy read as well. So Desperate Remedies is a Hardy novel that is quite a lot less well known, but I was really surprised by it and really loved. I'd never heard of it before, but it is brilliant. Really dramatic. I would say maybe a nice place to start with Hardy. It's not typical of Hardy, but it's a real page turner, which is really enjoyable. It's so dramatic. There are villainous characters and mysteries all over the place, and it's lovely. So good. It follows at the beginning a brother and sister who, after the death of their father, are kind of fallen on hard times. They've grown up in a kind of middle class environment, but now they have to fend for themselves. The brother, Owen, becomes an architect, and the sister, Cythrea, oh Hardy with your silly names, Cythrea goes to become the maid / companion of a wealthy woman, also by chance called Cythrea. Cythrea at the beginning of the novel kind of forms an attachment to one gentleman, but that doesn't seem to quite work, and then another mysterious gentleman appears and everything gets very dramatic and complicated from there. It's very exciting, very mysterious, has a few like dramatic, violent bits thrown in, and is just a wonderful read, and I was really surprised, as I'd never heard of it, by how brilliant it was. At number 19 I have The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers, which I'm certain you have all heard of before by this point because it has been everywhere on BookTube in the last year or 2. I thoroughly enjoyed this. It is a science fiction novel of just the kind that I like. I like science fiction a lot, but what I'm interested in science fiction is alien cultures and the way that different societies might operate in the future, and when like human society interacts with a non-human society, and that is what this does so well. Like, I'm not really that interested in the plot-driven science fiction. I'm interested in the kind of social commentary science fiction, and this does this so well. It is about a group of people, some of which are human, some of which are not, who are the crew of a spaceship moving through space on a kind of tunnelling mission. And the way that Becky Chambers creates the characters and the cultures of these different people is just so brilliantly done. It's wonderfully written, kind of episodic in its narrative. It doesn't have a kind of clear, massive plot. I mean, it does, but it's not about the plot, it's about the characters, and that's what I love about it. I think it's beautiful, well written, really interesting and engaging, and I just loved all the different cultures that Becky Chambers created. So yes, I'm really looking forward to the sequel of this as well. At number 18 we have Revenge by Yoko Ajawa. This is a series of interconnected short stories written by a Japanese author, Yoko Ajawa, and translated into English by Stephen Snyder. There are so many things I love about this collection. One, it is just wonderfully written, very cleverly done, and so dark in all of the creepiest but yet most brilliant ways. It's also consistently surprising. The book is called Revenge, and a lot of short stories include murders or very violent passages, and even though you know the book is called Revenge and you kind of know to expect it, they're always surprising. I don't know how she does it, but it's absolutely brilliantly written, and every single event is wonderfully surprising. I also love all the connections between the stories, because it's not immediately that clear, but all of the stories are linked in very, very small ways, and the links can be as small as someone walking past someone in the street, or driving past someone in the street, or someone reading a newspaper article about a murder which happens in another story, but they draw all of these messy stories together in a wonderful way, and it's just absolutely brilliant, and I cannot recommend it enough. Then at number 17, I have another Thomas Hardy, The Hand of Ethel Butter, which I actually read in December, so I don't know if my wrap-up will be up yet, but I will talk about it more there. The Hand of Ethel Butter, a bit like Desperate Remedies, is a very exciting, gripping Thomas Hardy novel, and a lot happens, a lot of plot points. Like, it's not actually that long, but as I was reading it, I couldn't believe how much had happened at every stage. It takes the character of Ethel Butter, who is a woman who comes from a family of servants, but she educated herself and eventually became a governess, and as a very young woman married a very wealthy man. Her young husband dies just a few weeks after they're married, but she then gets taken in by her mother-in-law and treated as a lady. Everyone in society comes to think of her as a lady, and the fact that her parents are servants and that her brothers are workmen is a secret she has to keep and not tell everyone in order to preserve the social status that she has. It's very, very cleverly done, really examines social class in a fascinating way, and there are so many other like interesting little things in there about, you know, what reasons are moral to marry someone. Should you marry for love, or should you marry to help your family and your status in life? There's also lovely things about creativity and artistry. Ethel Butter writes poetry and also does this thing, she kind of writes a novel but she doesn't publish it, she does dramatic readings of it. She won't print it, but she does dramatic readings where she acts it out. I like the fact that Thomas Hardy talks a lot about her poetry and her storytelling. It just adds a really nice other interesting element to the book. Definitely a Hardy worth reading. I don't know why it is so underrated. It's one I'd never heard of until this year, but it's absolutely brilliant and I cannot recommend it enough. Then at number 16 we have Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day by Winifred Watson. This is a thoroughly enjoyable book. I think the best word for Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day is just enjoyable. It's so utterly fun. It's about a woman called Miss Pettigrew who has all her life been kind of dull, I suppose, but she's not dull as a person, but she feels that her life has been quite dull. She's been a nanny and nursery maid. It was written in the 30s, I believe, and just all her life she feels like she hasn't really done anything very exciting. And then one day, by accident, by a strange series of coincidences, she ends up getting swept up into the life of a young woman called Miss LaFosse, who lives in the kind of high, glamorous, slightly crazy world of effectively the bright young things of the 1920s and 30s, and just for one day Miss Pettigrew gets swept up into this world and just completely has this new experience that she's never even glimpsed before, but she actually deals with it in this kind of wonderful way. She's such a fascinating character and it's just such a fun book, but as well as being really fun, it actually has a lot to say about like society and kind of individual identity, about, you know, whether Miss Pettigrew has always been this person that she kind of becomes in this day, or whether actually it's just whether Miss LaFosse and her friend are kind of influencing Miss Pettigrew to be a kind of different person. Like, there's so much in there, as well as it being really enjoyable, and just, yeah, definitely one to read. It is thoroughly fun. Then at number 15 I have The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. This is a very short book, almost a kind of novella I think, but I listened to it on audiobook and I think it's only about 7 hours long. I highly recommend the audiobook because Neil Gaiman reads it himself and it's so well done. It's just an incredibly engaging, brilliantly written book. Like, his writing is so beautiful, and I knew from the moment I started listening to it that I was going to love it. The other thing by Neil Gaiman I've read, American Gods, I didn't especially love. I liked it, but I found it just weird, and I didn't find it that engaging from the first, like, it took me a long time to get into it. But The Ocean at the End of the Lane is engaging from, like, the moment you start, and it's so weird, but so incredibly well done. It's about this boy, and in a series of coincidences, he finds himself caught up in weird magic realist events that are going on where he lives, and it's just thoroughly brilliantly written, so beautifully written, so creepy, so dark, especially considering the main character is a child, but also so good. There's a family of magical women basically that live nearby who he becomes friends with, and they're just such wonderful characters. It's such an enjoyable book and I really highly recommend it, even if you think you don't like Neil Gaiman, because I didn't love American Gods and I wasn't necessarily feeling like I was gonna ever read that much more by him, but The Ocean at the End of the Lane is just so beautiful, so well written, so good. Kind of joint 13th and 14th place I have The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss and its sequel The Wise Man's Fear by Patrick Rothfuss. These two books are the first two in the Kingkiller Chronicles, the third of which is not yet out, and I think this is definitely my favourite fantasy series I've ever read. I think Patrick Rothfuss writes beautifully, just incredibly. and his world and the cultures he creates are just wonderful. I think I said this in my wrap-up when I read The Name of the Wind originally back in March or whatever, but my priorities in books, like the thing I care about, the thing that makes it a good book for me is like characters, writing, world, plot. And most fantasy books are like world, plot, characters, writing. But Patrick Rothfuss writes beautifully, and his characters are so well done, and the world, the cultures he creates are just fantastic, and the plots are really brilliant and dramatic as well. But I love the attention to detail in the cultures, in the people, in the different ways that all of the different societies operate within this world. I love the magic system, I love the characters, I love the narrative structure, the fact that it's a frame narrative, story within a story. It's just every chapter, like every sentence is crafted beautifully. He writes so well, but also the story and the characters. Like, there's just so much in the Kingkiller Chronicles to adore. I think on balance, The Name of the Wind is probably a better book. And there was one aspect, one thing in The Wise Man's Fear which really annoys me. Like, Patrick Rothfuss is writing about a sexist world, and his main character, Quoth, is less sexist than the world, but still a bit sexist. And that's fine, and there are times when he explores that in a really interesting way, especially in Quoth's kind of hero complex, because there's a lot of time where he like saves women and he's like, oh, she could have saved herself, but I saved her. And that's okay, like I can deal with that, because at times it gets a bit problematic, but for the most part, his female characters are still interesting. It's just that they are stuck within this world that doesn't allow them to be as interesting as they could be, almost. But there's a bit in The Wise Man's Fear which is just like male wish fulfillment for like a few chapters, and it's just silly and annoying and unnecessary, Patrick Rothfuss. Unnecessary. But the book is so good, both books are so good, that I can kind of forgive it. Like, I can look past it. It's annoying, it shouldn't have been there, he could have done better. But both books are still so brilliant that they still make it into my top 20 of the year, because he can write so well, and the worlds he creates, the way that the book is done is just so absolutely brilliant. Then at number 12 I have Even the Dogs by John McGregor. As I have mentioned several times before, John McGregor is possibly my favourite living author. He's a brilliant writer, he writes beautifully, wonderfully. His novels are also different and all deal with such important themes. His use of time and structure is wonderful, and Even the Dogs is no exception. This is not a happy book. None of his books are happy. This is the most miserable, I think. This is the most depressing and heart-wrenching. Like, it's very, very good, but not cheerful. Even the Dogs begins with the death of a man who has been effectively squatting in a flat that he used to own but no longer has the right to live in. He is an alcoholic, and most of his friends are homeless people and drug addicts, and the book follows what happens after his death, especially to his friends. It deals a lot with people who live on the streets, it deals a lot with drug addiction, it deals a lot with problems within families, it deals a lot with the struggles of mental health, it deals with so many things, and it's heart-wrenching and so upsetting, but it's so good, it's so well written, it's so powerful and moving, and just, as always, John McGregor writes incredibly, and this is definitely worth a read. I highly recommend it. At number 11 is The Egoist by George Meredith. This is a Victorian novel by an author who I hadn't read anything by until this year. Fairly near the beginning, the main central couple in the book get engaged, and the book basically follows their engagements and the efforts of Clara, the woman, to extract herself from this engagement after she soon realises that maybe this man is not someone she really wants to marry. It's a fascinating book. The characters are so well done, and it just explores gender within the Victorian period, and engagement and courtship and power play between men and women within the Victorian period in such a fascinating way, because basically the book is about Clara trying to end this engagement and her fiance just refusing to let her go. I don't think I've read another Victorian novel that does such interesting things with gender. This is not a good place to start with Victorian literature. It is possibly the least accessible Victorian novel I've ever read. The Victorian novel I've read which I found the most difficult to read. I think I said this at the time when I read it, but for me it felt more like reading Shakespeare than reading a Victorian novel in terms of difficulty level, and I read a lot of Victorian literature, but it's hard, it's dense, the language is not easy, sometimes people have conversations and you're like, I don't know what you're saying here. And for the first third of the book I was quite confused, but once I got into it, once I realised exactly what George Meredith was doing and how wonderful and fascinating his exploration of gender was, just how powerful a woman Clara is, and just how the way that George Meredith talks about marriage and the way that it forces women into a kind of slavery. Like, it's just wonderful, it's just awesome, it's so good, and I highly recommend it, but maybe only if you're someone who knows already that you like Victorian literature and is willing to put up with a little bit of tricky language. At number 10, I have another Victorian novel, and that is New Grub Street by George Gissing. I think he's such a talented writer. I've described him before as the urban Hardy, but I feel actually he is even more depressing than Hardy, because sometimes in Hardy things happen and you don't quite believe that they're real. Like, there's a lot of sadness and misery, but it doesn't feel quite real. Whereas George Gissing feels so down to earth and so completely real and so heartbreaking that it's just horrible. Like, brilliant, don't get me wrong, wonderful, but also just breaks your heart a lot. I love New Grub Street a lot. It basically deals with writers and the literary circles within the 1880s in London, with people who are middle class in their education but have so little money, that are really kind of on the breadline, really struggling to find enough money for their rent, for their food. People who occupy one sphere and one social circle in their kind of academic life and in their education, but a completely different circle in their actual economic circumstances, which I think is a really interesting group of people to look at in the Victorian period. The two main characters, Jasper and Edwin, are both writers, but Edwin is striving for literary merit. He wants to be a really brilliant writer. He's had 2 novels that were a success, and then since then has been struggling to write, whereas Jasper, his main aim in being a writer, in being a man of letters, is to write for money. He wants to be rich, he wants to be famous, he wants to be successful. Literary merit doesn't come into it for him. And the way that these two characters approach their economic and their writing life, and the way that they also therefore approach their personal life, is just really, really interesting. It's not a happy, cheerful book, but it's absolutely brilliant, so wonderful, so fascinatingly written, so powerful, so raw, and the characters are so realistic, the situation's so poignant, and it's just, I cannot recommend it enough. Definitely please go read George Gissing. He is very much an underrated Victorian novelist that everybody should read more. Then at number 9, I have another short story collection, and that is The Not Dead and the Saved by Kate Clancy. Every time I read something by Kate Clancy, I am amazed by her power with words, and she's just an absolutely talented, fascinating writer. I love the short story collection. It's absolutely beautiful, so well written, so engaging. All of the characters and the stories and the plots are so well done. It's a realist short story collection, which always appeals to me, and I love that there are kind of subtle links between the stories. There's not a connected short story collection, but a theme that runs throughout this book is that of mothers and children, of motherhood and the connection between mothers and children, whether it's a biological mother or a surrogate mother or a mother figure. It's just really, really nicely done throughout this book, and it's nice to have a theme that kind of links all of the stories together. So powerful, so well written. She does wonderful things with language, and yes, I cannot recommend this enough. It is a brilliant, brilliant short story collection, and one I highly recommend. Then at number 8, the other Hardy novel in my top 20, I have The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy, which may be my new favourite Hardy novel. I haven't quite decided whether it beats Jude the Obscure and Far From the Madding Crowd, but I think it might. The Woodlanders is a wonderful, brilliant novel which follows a character called Grace and her interactions with men and with her society. She occupies an odd social position. Her parents are working class, and she has grown up in this area that is surrounded by woodlands, but she goes off to become educated, and she becomes much more of a lady than her family, and this puts her in an odd social position, especially when it comes to who she's going to marry. It's a dramatic, brilliant, moving, tender book with so much tragedy, as always, in Hardy, but also moments of real poignancy and emotion, of real connection between characters. I think Grace is a fascinating character, one of Hardy's best characters, one of Hardy's best heroines, and there are so many other wonderful characters in there as well. The whole book is just fascinating, and yeah, probably my new favourite Hardy. It was very, very good indeed. Then at number 7, I have We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. This was also in Nick's favourite books of the year. I will link that down below if you haven't seen it. And I agree that it is a thoroughly, thoroughly brilliant book. So amazing. One of those books that has such wonderful writing and such wonderful characterisation, and you're reading it and you think it's a very, very good book, and then suddenly you get to one page and one thing happens which switches things around, and suddenly it goes from being a really, really good book to being an absolutely brilliant, incredible book. I really need to read some more by Shirley Jackson because she's clearly a very, very talented writer, and I loved this. It was thoroughly enjoyable, thoroughly gripping, and so well written. It follows the character of a young girl, an 18-year-old called Mary Cat, who lives with her sister and her uncle in a house that is a bit deserted, and no one else ever comes to see them. They have been shunned by society because many years ago, Mary Cat's elder sister Constance was accused of murdering the whole of their family. So psychologically fascinating and just a wonderful, wonderful read. And then at number 6, another Victorian novel, I have Bartus the Towers by Anthony Trollope. This is the second book in the Barsetshire Chronicles, but Bartus the Towers has definitely been my favourite one so far. It basically looks at church politics in the town of Barchester and follows the various conflicts between high church and low church, which doesn't sound that exciting, but the way that Trollope represents these two schools of thought in different opposing characters is just wonderful. There's a nice love story in there. There is so much politics and kind of bitchy, awful Victorian politeness. It's wonderful. It's wonderfully and beautifully written, and just one of those Victorian novels that leaves you just grinning at the end so much. And it was just an absolutely wonderful, wonderful, enjoyable read. And yes, I highly recommend the Bartus Chronicles. Talking of underrated Victorian literature, my fifth favourite book of the year is The Half-Sisters by Geraldine Dewsbury. I do not understand why this book is out of print. I just don't. It's so good. The Half-Sisters is a mid-Victorian novel which looks at the relationship and lives of two sisters, Bianca and Alice. Alice and Bianca have the same father, but different mothers and completely different upbringings and lives. Alice is very, very British, middle class, respectable. Her aim in life is to get married and have a family. Bianca is half Italian, moves to Britain at the beginning of the book, and she ends up becoming an actress and pursuing a very, very different life to her sister. The way that Geraldine Dewsbury explores the differences in lives between these two sisters, and through that explores the very different kind of lives women can have within the 19th century, is just wonderful. The stuff she says about gender, the stuff she says about respectability is just fascinating. What I especially love about this is that basically, of the two lives and paths the sisters go down, Alice has the respectable life. Her life is the symbol, the pinnacle of British middle class, Victorian respectability, whereas Bianca, she is an actress, which within the Victorian period is basically considered as pretty close to being a prostitute. She is not respectable, she is not considered virtuous or moral, and yet actually the way the sisters live their lives really just turns all of those stereotypes and assumptions on their heads and really questions a lot of Victorian morals and ideas about morality and what kind of lives women should lead. It's just wonderful, wonderfully written, wonderfully carried out. Fascinating conversations, really easy to get into, explore such wonderful themes, and I just think it's a wonderful, wonderful Victorian book. My fourth favourite book of 2016 was Last Night in Montreal by Emily St. John Mandel. I only read this 2 days ago. It's really hard to tell whether if I had read this 6 months ago it would still be as high in my top 20. It would definitely be in my top 20, but it's hard to tell because it was one of those books where, because it's still so fresh in my mind and so brilliant. Emily St. John Mandel rivals John McGregor for my favourite living author, and she is incredibly talented. So talented. So talented. There is another book by her yet to come in my top 20, so I'll talk more about her in general then, but suffice to say she is a wonderful writer, and I love her balance between beautiful writing, brilliant characters, wonderful, interesting structure and time frame, but also gripping plots. Her books are so engaging. I received this book for Christmas. I started reading it at about midday on Christmas Day, read a little bit like before Christmas dinner, and then picked it up again about page 80 at about 10 at night and finished it at 1:30 in the morning before I went to bed. I read this basically in one sitting and it was such a thoroughly engaging experience, such a good book. It follows the character of Lilia. Lilia's parents get divorced when she is about 3 and her mother gets custody, and then 4 years later her father comes and abducts her from her mother's house, takes her away, and they disappear, they vanish. They live a life on the road, never staying somewhere more than a few months or weeks at a time because they're constantly on the run from Lilia's mother. And the book picks up Lilia when she's much older, when she's in her 20s, but she has got used to this life of moving on, of never staying anywhere more than a few weeks, more than a few months. At the beginning of the book, we meet her and her boyfriend Eli. She has been in New York 6 months, and 6 months is too long for Lilia. She vanishes and Eli tries to find her. And the book basically looks at Eli trying to find Lilia in the present, but also finding out more about Lilia's life and what happened, what led to her being taken by her father and the kind of life that they led. It's so exciting, so gripping, yet so powerful and beautiful, and explores such interesting themes. One of the things I love about Emily St. John Mandel is that even things that feel like they should be small have so much effort put into them. Like, even the smallest things are so thought about and brilliant. One of the things I loved about this, so Eli he works in an art gallery, but he's also a scholar. He's also writing his thesis, and his thesis is about languages that are dying, languages which are spoken by such a small number of people that they will soon die out. So all of the languages that he's studying are disappearing in the same way that Lilia is disappearing. Like, it's so clever, it's so good. Just, yeah, what a talented author. She's amazing. Anyway, and my third favourite book of the year by my other favourite living author is So Many Ways to Begin by John McGregor. I love John McGregor. I talk about this a lot. I'm probably going to do an author spotlight on him in the next month or so because I think he's so talented and I just want to talk more about all the reasons why I love him. He writes beautifully. That's one of the main reasons. His writing is like writing goals. It's very, very good. Many Ways to Begin follows the life story of a man called David and also his relationship with his wife Eleanor. It moves through time, showing you different glimpses of his life and his relationship with his wife and with his mother and the rest of his family. David is a curator and the book is narrated through a series of objects and the memories they inspire in him. So it goes in chronological order, but it's basically like a kind of museum of his life that he has curated to tell this story of what's happened to him and how his life's been. It's so moving, so poignant, sad, yes, not the most cheerful, but so well written, so beautiful, and just so well done, so poignant and so well written. I love his writing and I love that his characters always feel so real. I love that John McGregor writes about normality but makes it extraordinary by the language he uses. That's what I love about him and that's what I love about this. A very, very good book and one I cannot recommend enough, as I keep on saying with all of these books. But anyway, finally into the top 2. My second favourite book of the year is another one by Emily St. John Mandel, and it is The Lola Quartet. Now, I read this before So Many Ways to Begin, and I did say when I had finished So Many Ways to Begin that it was my favourite book of the year so far. But then when I was reading Last Night in Montreal on Christmas Day, I remembered why I love Emily St. John Mandel so much, and I remembered especially how brilliant this book was, and I thought, actually no, I prefer this to So Many Ways to Begin. Everyone who has read Station 11 and not the rest of her books, please go and read some more by her, because I love Station 11, it's very, very good, but all the rest of her books are just as good as Station 11, and it saddens me to see them being neglected because, yeah, she is so talented, so talented, so talented. The Lola Quartet, like the other 2 of her books I've read, follows 2 different time frames roughly and several different characters. In the present day, we meet Gavin, whose life is beginning to crumble during the recession. Everything is kind of going wrong for him. And then he meets up with his sister, and his sister shows him a photograph of a young girl, 10 years old, who looks like she is Gavin's daughter. And this leads Gavin to look back on his life 10 years ago and examine everything that happened in his final year at high school. In his final year of high school, he was in a jazz quartet, the Lola Quartet, with 3 other people. And the book looks a lot at what happened on their last night of high school, on their last concert, looks at Gavin's relationship now and then, and the characters of these 4 people he was in the quartet with, and also the sister of one of the members of the quartet who was Gavin's girlfriend when they were at school. It is so dramatic, like so exciting. There is so much drama and complicatedness here. There is so much danger and violence and pressure and dramatic occurrences. In some ways it feels like a thriller, but it's also beautifully written with wonderful characters, with fascinating relationships. I love, for example, the relationship between Gavin and his sister, and I love the way that it looks at how all these characters change between when they're 18 and when they're 28, how it looks at how things can change over time and how the relationships of these characters fade but also are connected. I love the way it looks at music because I love that as a theme in books. I just love the writing. It's just so well written and so good, and I just don't understand how she can be this talented. Like, this is the aim. This is the goal. John McGregor is like the writing goal, but in terms of like the whole package, the balance of plot and drama and characters and writing, she is the goal. She is the goal. Again, if you have read Station 11 but nothing else by her, please read this and please read The Last Night in Montreal. She is amazing. Anyway. But my favourite book of the year, ultimately, is The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton. I've owned this about 3 years and I only picked it up last month in November and I just absolutely loved it. I loved it so much. One of the things I really loved about it is that it's so long. I think there are 2 different things I really love. Like, a middling length book is fine, but what I really love is a book that is a length where you can read it in one day, like The Last Night in Montreal, because that experience of reading a book in just a day is so absorbing and wonderful, and I love it. But the other thing I love is a book that's really long, that takes you a month to read, where you get so engaged over time with all of these characters, with all of these plots, that it's just so rewarding when you get to the end, because you're so invested. I love The Luminaries because it's set in the 19th century, which I love, and deals a lot with kind of British 19th century manners and culture, which I love, but it's set in New Zealand, which is something I don't know about, and it's set in the mining communities of New Zealand in the 19th century, which is something I don't know that much about, which is very exciting. I love that it's in a way a murder mystery, but it's so much more about the characters and the relationships between them that is what takes precedent. I love that it has so many characters. There are at least 15, maybe more, central characters here, but they're all so different. They're all from such completely different backgrounds and walks of life. They have such different temperaments and personalities and aims, but they're all connected by this kind of weird mystery. The fact that at the beginning of this book, a man who has never been presumed rich is found dead with a huge fortune in his house. A very wealthy man disappears, and a prostitute is found in the street and accused of trying to kill herself, something she denies. I love that there are kind of magic realist undertones in here, but everything slightly magical that happens could also be explained by fact or coincidence. I love that even when things are being revealed near the end, you don't never quite know actually what's real, but at the same time you know enough to solve the mystery, to piece things together for yourself in a satisfying way. I love that it's so beautifully written and that she takes such care with all of her characters, with her sentences, that she writes in a really accessible, enjoyable way, but also very powerfully. I just thought this was a wonderful, wonderful book, and I was so engaged. I love that it's so long. I love that you can get so engaged in this brilliant, brilliant story, and I'm very much looking forward to anything else by Eleanor Catton. This book, absolutely incredible. My favourite book of 2016. I hope you have enjoyed this video and hearing about some of my favourite books of the year. There were very many that were absolutely incredible, and it's been a joy to read all of these. Please let me know down in the comments if you have read any of these books, if you enjoyed them, if you didn't, and what your favourite book of the year was, because I would love to know. I'll be back very soon with another video, and in the meantime, happy reading. I'm sorry this one was so long.